And we're live.
Okay, looks like we're live. Thanks so much there, Brother Matt. Thanks for joining us, everybody. My apologies for the late start. Unfortunately, there were some technical difficulties. It happens, so my apologies, but we are live and we're good to go. So this is going to be exciting. I'm looking forward to this one. It's an honor to be your host and moderator tonight. So like I said, tonight is going to be one to remember. We've got two incredibly knowledgeable individuals who are both no stranger to these topics. John has been here many times. Ron was here just last week. So I want to thank both these gentlemen for giving us their time. Tonight's going to be fun. We're going to have opening statements, up to 10 minutes. Whatever's not used on either side, we'll throw into the discussion portion. And I guess, Ron, based on your time, we'll let the discussion portion maybe go 30, 35 minutes just to give us some time to go over as many questions as we can. So everybody in the audience, typically we got a lot of questions that come in, so we'll do as many as we can. Make sure you tag myself. I'll save them, and yeah, we'll have a quick Q&A at the end. So enough for me. Before we get into our openings, I'm going to just give the floor to both John and Ron just for 30 seconds or so, go over, I guess, who they are, what they're doing, just kind of break the ice a bit. Ron, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me back. My name is Ron Garret. I am a software engineer by trade. In a previous life, I was a scientist, which is to say I once made my living by doing scientific research and publishing peer-reviewed papers. I'm not a biologist, I'm a computer scientist, but I worked on artificial intelligence research for NASA for 12 years. So I've had the rare privilege of getting to see firsthand how the scientific sausage is made and made a bit of it myself.
Awesome. Great intro there, Ron. Yeah, we're happy to have you back. The last debate, people really enjoyed it. We got a lot of good feedback, so you're always welcome here.
Thank you.
Keep the discussions respectful and engaging. So, and you as well, John, thanks for joining us tonight, brother.
Oh, it's always fun. Appreciate y'all having me on again. My name's John. I go by Logical, Plausible, Probable here on YouTube. If you want to check out my channel, just put that in, and it'll come right up. What I'm doing on YouTube these days is much more focused on addressing some of the issues in relation to intelligent design versus Darwinism and in my opinion, the obvious evidence for the requirement for an intelligent agent. And then obviously from there, you can extrapolate out all of the philosophical implications to what that potentially means. But that's kind of what I've been focused on recently. And it's fun doing these kinds of things. And my background's also in tech, not to the same level as Ron's, but I've dove around in that just a little bit, and it's always fun to engage with people who are knowledgeable on a variety of subjects, and look at things from a big picture.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that intro, John. Yeah, why don't we get right into it? I think we agreed. Ron, you're going to start. Awesome. I'll set the timer. Like I said, whatever's not used, we'll just throw into the discussion portion, but take your time. Whenever you're ready, I'll start the clock.
Okay. So I'm an evolutionist, but I've spent a fair amount of time studying creationism because I believe it's important to understand points of view that I don't agree with. So when I was in grad school, one of my advisors told me that it's important to pay attention to what smart people say, even when they're wrong, because they're usually wrong in interesting ways, and you'll learn something by understanding how and why they got it wrong. One of the things that I've observed about creationists is that they will often raise straw man arguments. That is, they will argue against things that nobody actually believes, or certainly things that I don't believe. The classic example of this is that old chestnut that man evolved from monkeys. Why are there still monkeys? And happily, that one seems to have fallen out of fashion. But it's been replaced by other arguments that are just as invalid. An example of this is the title that you, John, originally wanted to give to this debate, Intelligent Design versus Undirected Evolution. There's a straw man argument embedded in that title because evolution is not undirected. It's directed by natural selection towards greater reproductive fitness. You very graciously agreed to change the title, but you also said something that puzzled me. You said that my calling undirected evolution a straw man was ironic. And that had me puzzled because I couldn't imagine why you would think it was ironic. So this morning I did a little digging and found an article by Troy Lacey on Answers in Genesis that was posted just 2 or 3 weeks ago called Directed Evolution. And I read it and suddenly it all made sense. And by that, I don't mean that intelligent design made sense, but it made sense that you would consider it ironic for me to call undirected evolution a straw man. And I mention all this just to demonstrate to you that I have done at least a little bit of homework and that I really am ready to make a good faith effort to understand where you're coming from. And I hope you'll extend me the same courtesy. So having studied intelligent design, it's not just the Lacey piece, but also Behe and most recently John Sanford and a few others. I am, to put it mildly, unconvinced. I see at least 3 major problems with the ID position. The first is a failure to achieve clarity on whether ID is meant to be a theological hypothesis or a scientific one. AIG, Answers in Genesis, for example, is constantly bouncing back and forth between science and theology. If you want to argue for ID from a theological point of view, then this is going to be a very short debate because I'm just going to concede that you're right. It says right there in Genesis that God created us. And if you believe that Genesis is true, then that's it. We're done. It's a slam dunk. So I'm going to assume that you brought me here to talk about ID from a scientific point of view. And now we can have an interesting discussion. So you may be surprised to hear me say that I think that ID is a perfectly respectable scientific hypothesis. Because when you first look at life, it really does appear to be designed. Life is a mind-bogglingly complex process with a zillion parts that seem to all have to fit together in just the right way in order to get it to work. And it is hard to see how all that complexity could possibly have come about without a designer. I readily concede all that. And I'd like to ask you to note that I concede it because I watched a lot of people argue for ID and they spend a lot of time talking about examples of things in life that appear to be designed. We can save time by skipping all that because I concede all that. Life, when you first look at it, does indeed appear to be designed. And one very plausible explanation for the fact that it appears to be designed is that it was in fact designed. And indeed, for thousands of years, that was the only explanation. But it turns out that that is not the correct explanation. And there are a lot of ways to see that ID is not the correct explanation, starting with the fact that ID has no scientific answer to the question, who was or is the designer? There's a theological answer, of course, God. But again, if you're going to argue from a theological point of view, this is going to be a very short debate. From a scientific point of view, it seems much more plausible to me that our designer was, if we had a designer, that it was some kind of intelligent alien, but I've never seen any ID proponent take that hypothesis seriously. So that's the second problem with ID. I've never seen anyone give a plausible scientific account of who our designer was or is, only a theological one. And the third problem with ID is that the people who advocate for it, they really know their biology, but they seem to be profoundly ignorant of some of the basic scientific results in computability theory and information theory. I recently read John Sanford's book on genetic entropy, which is a little off topic, except that genetic entropy is supposed to be evidence for intelligent design. And that book is just a hot mess. I wrote a review of it if you really want to know see the details, but the problems seem to be endemic throughout the ID community. For example, one of the fashionable arguments in ID today is that random mutation cannot create information. But the people who advance this argument don't seem to understand what information actually is. Sanford certainly doesn't. There's a whole field of study called information theory, and Sanford appears never to have even heard of it. Once you understand what information actually is, it's not at all hard to see how evolution can create it. So let me close my opening by saying that ID proponents are correct on one point. It is not easy to see the full picture of how the vast complexity of life could have come about by purely natural processes. It's complicated. It has taken a long time and a lot of concerted effort by a lot of really smart and dedicated people to work it out, and some parts of it are still being worked out. Abiogenesis in particular is still very much a work in progress. But an argument from incredulity is not a valid argument. Just because you don't see how something is possible doesn't mean that it is not possible. Mankind used to believe that the heavens were made of very different stuff than the earth. After all, the heavens appear at first glance to obey very different laws of physics than here on Earth. Earth is chaotic, the heavens are orderly. On Earth, things fall down and they fall apart. In the heavens, they stay aloft and endure. On earth, the natural tendency of objects is to come to rest. In the heavens, the natural tendency is for things to remain in motion. The two could hardly be more different, so it is hard at first blush to see how the heavens and the earth could possibly be made of the same stuff and obey the same laws. But they are, and they do. Likewise, it's hard to see how something that seems designed could have come about without a designer, but it did. From a scientific point of view, this is about as open to reasonable doubt as the proposition that the moon and the sun and the stars are made of the same stuff and obey the same laws of physics that hold here on Earth.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you there, Ron. With a few minutes to spare as well. So 7 minutes right on the dot. We'll throw that into the discussion. And John, whenever you're ready, you can proceed with your opening.
Well, before I get started, I want to say thanks to Ron for taking the time to have this debate. You know, as someone who used to spend a lot of time trying to secure meetings with people of your background and status, I understand how lucky we are to have you and the value of your time. However, in regards to our debate tonight, I would wager, just like so many of the investors and people in the tech community I've watched turn down revolutionary and even sometimes just good startup ideas for investment, only to observe them flush money on ideas that are blaringly stupid, often because someone who was supposedly an expert told them they could expect a 50 to 100x return on their money. I'm afraid Ron is doing the exact same thing with his buy-in to what is quite possibly the greatest scam ever perpetuated in the history of humanity. Now, on the surface, do evolutionary salesmen claiming to have a bulletproof, proven beyond all doubt explanation for our existence have a great pitch deck? Absolutely, they do. But just like so many investors discover, often well after that first board meeting, if they had engaged in a bit more due diligence, the over-the-top forecast in the prospectus would not have been considered rational. It is likely, as he already mentioned, that he will consider what I'm about to say next to be nothing but a straw man. However, if he believes it to be so, he'll have to explain how in any other context, the technologies that enable life to exist, including what humans are attempting to accomplish at this very moment, could be formed through undirected process. He will claim that natural selection qualifies as direction. Yet, per the current positions held by the experts he believes to be correct, natural selection is not the cause of the mutations which they claim have the capacity to result in entirely new functions. Instead, it is nothing but a concept referencing the perpetuation of differences between generations. Moreover, it is now known beyond doubt that many of the things previously viewed as supposed evidence for the theory are not caused by mutations. Rather, are controlled modifications to existing functions or deletions of a portion of existing capabilities. To believe that all forms of life have evolved through random mutations perpetuated by natural selection, rather than have been created by an intelligent agent, and given the ability to adapt through the very processes we are currently attempting to copy in many aspects of our technology, well, this justifies arguments of incredulity. So I asked my opponent, how do you explain read, write, and erase functions which execute controlled modifications, many of which result in significant morphological changes, yet are not the result of mutations? Not only that, they can be reversed, also in a controlled manner. To me, unless you're going to argue that natural selection, which does not have the ability to travel back in time to cause this to occur, can somehow travel back in time, how this can be perceived as direction seems rather ridiculous. This is not to say that mutations do not occur, for we all know that they do. But those same experts admit 99.9% of them have no effect, a sum-zero effect, or a negative one. This leads me to another question from my opponent about the validity of the supposed evidence for evolution through natural selection. For over 50 years, the experts he believes have the answers have argued the only portion of the genome that was worthy of investigation were the protein coding genes. Now, while my opponent, from things I've heard before, seems to believe in positions postulated by Richard Dawkins, such as selfish gene theory, we are also talking about an expert among many who have adamantly argued the other 98% of the genome is nothing but evidence for evolution and just junk DNA. However, he is now faced with the daunting reality that not only has the ability to dismiss the majority of DNA disappeared, we are now realizing that it not only controls the genes, but also massive elements of phenotype. Beyond this, it is now becoming apparent that not only do genes have incredible variability due to transcription factors and other regulatory controls, they also directly interact with each other to modify needed pre-existing outcomes. If this is not enough, it is now known that not only does this occur inside of an individual chromosome, it is also happening between them. To state that this proves location relevance of gene sequences, promoters, and even introns in both linear and three-dimensional structure is now beyond doubt. This is all before considering the massive cascades which occur with very minor modification, and without attempting to explain the temporal variables now on full display. Therefore, the very premise that evolution through natural selection need only affect individual genes is actually being accused of blinding research since its adoption, as these interactions are shattering the gene-centered paradigm. This dogmatic loyalty to evolution through natural selection leads me to yet another comparison with investors. The startups that are funded have burned through 6 rounds of capital, have gone through 5 pivots, and are now back begging for another round of investment. Listen, they say with confidence, we've been doing a detailed analysis of our metrics, and we are on the edge of a breakthrough. You just need to buy in one more time. As an investor, you are now faced with a choice. Do you cut your losses and run, lick your wounds and live to fight another day? Or do you give in to ego and burn another round of capital in this failed concept? Of course, Darwinism is no longer a startup. It had its IPO 100 years ago, and its proponents are still selling it as the ultimate investment in answering the question of how we exist. But does it? So let's look at yet another position and point that its advocates claim is proof of its validity, and its phylogeny. Now this one really gets me. Not only are they admitting in their papers how sporadic and contradictory their findings are based on assumptions they insert, it is literally based on trying to guess what random mutations would have to occur in order for an entirely new function to come into existence. Now, since my opponent is rather familiar with software, to put it mildly, I ask him this. If someone came to you and said, hey, we're looking at a bunch of websites built on WordPress we think evolved from a common ancestor. We are ignoring 98% of the source code, but it seems there are some similar plugins which appear to be slightly modified but have foundationally based functions. Now, in order to determine lineages, we're writing an algorithm to determine the random changes during backups that would have needed to occur in order to see how the lines of code needed evolved to create these new functions. First, I wager you would look at them like they were idiots. Second, I wager you rather incredulously ask if they were going to ignore the JavaScript, HTML, CSS, the database, etc. in making this comparison. Third, if they told you everything else wasn't relevant, only the plugins, you would probably laugh them out of the room. Now, obviously, we would hope nobody would be stupid enough to actually engage in this hypothetical. Yet this is exactly what is happening in research labs around the world regarding biology. But what would be the more rational explanation of these similarities? Is each website different? Yes. But in the modern era of programming, would anyone of merit not use existing scripts and frameworks for basic functions and then make modifications? The answer, of course, is yes. Just like would anyone argue because 2 systems use the Bootstrap framework, they were somehow related from an evolutionary perspective? Obviously, I think not. Of course, this is all before the discovery of microRNAs and how the exact same phylogeny models done for protein coding genes show totally different results. Not only do they not follow the supposed evolutionary tree, in the genome, they are usually not even part of the gene being expressed. In fact, these additional elements are often at great relative distance, are expressed and modified in a completely separate manner, then physically transported by export proteins to bind with a specific location on a now mature mRNA. This process results in a single microRNA being able to modify the outcome of a single gene in hundreds, in some cases thousands of ways. Not only that, it has even been discovered they have different functions at different stages of development. This leads me to gene repeats, and how this too is argued to be evidence for evolution. Yet since different portions of the genome are active in different cell types, and we know that it as close to real-time access as possible, along with structural proximity to others, is vital. This is like saying the usage of a CDN to accelerate load times is not a smart idea, nor evidence for intelligent thought. I'd wager every technology company on this planet would think anyone telling them CDNs are a bad idea would also get laughed out of the room. But what are we being confronted with in determining which conclusion is more rational? Intelligent design or evolution through natural selection? In this opening, I've outlined some rather massive flaws in several key factors presented by evolutionists as supposed proof. In closing, let me present an overview to what ultimately must be explained in order for life to exist. First, you must account for abiogenesis. Second, you must account for the genetic code. Third, you must account for the multivariable logic gates and if-then-else functions required for gene expression. Fourth, you must explain the secondary code base which controls protein synthesis and is executed through dual syntax. Fifth, you must explain how random mutations in natural selection can account for time-based controls that are essential to embryo development. Finally, you must explain how just these few variables are rationally possible without an intelligent agent, when in any other context it would be considered ludicrous to conclude any of this could happen without foreknowledge of the desired outcome. I look forward to having this debate, and since we're trying to keep this short, I will shut up and we can get going.
Awesome. Well, thanks to the both of you for your openings, very clear and concise. Great job. Yeah, let's move right into everybody's favorite part of a debate, of course, the discussion portion. So we've got just over an hour here, which means we'll do about 35 to 40 minutes of discussion and end it with a Q&A. We'll see how it goes. So whoever wants to kick it off, go ahead.
Ron, go for it. I just talked.
Yeah, okay, I'll start. Let me start by saying I loved the first half of your opening. I thought that was great, and you made some actually very valid points. And I really love the analogy to placing a bet on a startup, because there's a lot of validity to that. There is so much information out there in the world today that no one is capable of assessing it all for themselves firsthand. You have no choice but to place your trust in the assessments of other people to a certain extent, if for nothing else than to trust them to provide you with trustworthy raw data, because nobody can do the experiments themselves. So you have to at least trust people who've done the experiments that they are reporting the results of the experiments accurately. The second half of your opening, oh boy. There's a lot to digest there. And just at the end, you asked 7 questions. And we have a total of 35 minutes here. And so it seems pretty hopeless to try to address all of them. So maybe you'd like to just pick 1 or 2 to focus on. But I'd like to make another sort of blanket disclaimer here that's kind of in line with the original question that you asked, which I think is a very valid one to ask, and I'm going to give you my answer to it. I'm not a biologist. A lot of the stuff you just said, I am vaguely familiar with it. I kind of sort of know what it means. But the details, I have no idea. If you were to point me to a paper, I could probably go read it and form an informed opinion. But at the moment, I don't have one. And despite the fact that I don't have one, I still believe in evolution. Why? It's because I have faith, for want of a better term, in the process. And part of the reason I have faith in it is because I've been a part of it. And I recognize that that puts me in a uniquely privileged position. And that's actually one of the reasons that I'm here, is to sort of give testimony about that experience that I've had. So one of the tactics that I've seen ID proponents use that I didn't mention in my opening, that I probably should have put in there, I thought I was going to run long, that's why I left it out, is to point out problems in evolutionary theory. And no doubt there are problems. In fact, that's true across all science. That is, in fact, how science makes progress. The scientific process always starts with a problem, with something that the current best theories are incapable of explaining. And the way that you make progress is you start out by making some hypotheses, some guesses about what could possibly be an explanation for this thing that currently cannot be explained. And you kick those around, and it goes through a process of elimination. The first step of that process is just to eliminate the hypotheses that are at odds with currently known data. And that turns out to usually eliminate most of the candidates. The framework of scientific knowledge at this point is pretty well developed. And coming up with a new hypothesis that's consistent with everything that's currently known is really, really hard. And I know we're here to talk about intelligent design. There, it's a lot more ambiguous and difficult. But I want to just give you an example of why I put my faith in science with regards to a different topic that we're not here to talk about, and that is young Earth creationism. I got interested in this by studying the arguments of young Earth creationists, because I was interested in how they're able to sustain a belief in this in the face of such overwhelming evidence against it. And I actually came to a certain grudging respect for them because of their intellectual honesty. The young Earth creationists that I've met, they start out from a theological point of view. They say, I believe in the Bible. And the Bible says the world was created in 7 days, and it's a reasonable inference from the rest of the stuff that's in there that it's 6,000 years old. And they stick to that. And I respect that. If you start from that assumption, that is a logical conclusion. But I don't start from that assumption. I start from the assumption that the data is, and an experiment is the most reliable guide to the truth. And the conclusion that the universe is 6,000 years old is so much at odds with the data, and you basically have to completely reinvent physics in order to sustain that belief. And nobody has come close to anything, even a plausible reinvention of physics. So the reason I believe in biology,
I would have to interject that.
Sorry, go ahead.
I would have to interject that some of the retrocausality elements they're discovering in the last couple of years in relation to quantum mechanics would potentially open the door to counter your position there. But that's a whole nother debate.
Yeah, let's absolutely put that on the agenda, because I would love to take you on quantum mechanics, because that's something I actually do know something about. But biology, I don't. I put my faith in biologists. And the reason I put my faith in biologists is because the scientific process is such that if there really is somebody who's come up with a defensible solution to any of the currently outstanding problems, and there are currently outstanding problems. There's certainly things that we do not fully understand about how life arose or even how it works today. If a person comes up with a plausible hypothesis, they can submit it to a scientific journal and it will get published, and they will become famous and they will make a career out of having solved this problem. Science celebrates the calling attention to problems and hypotheses, advancing of hypotheses that solve those problems. We celebrate.
Well, see, I would have to disagree with you.
Let me just finish. The alternative is to say that there's a big conspiracy, that there's a conspiracy against creationism, and that biologists have circled the wagons around evolutionary theory, and no dissent is allowed. And that's also possible. But the reason I don't believe it is because I've been in the room where it happens, and I haven't seen any evidence that there is such a conspiracy. And that's the answer to your question, why do I put my trust in biologists? I'm done.
Gotcha. No, well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I understand where you're coming from for sure. And, part of the reason that I don't really care about discussing is there a conspiracy theory or not. I mean, to me, that's neither here nor there on the questions at hand. I take the time to read the papers that are being published. And when you look at the number of, surprisingly, basically, we can't believe that this is what we're discovering because it directly contradicts gigantic fundamentals of our theory. And then you even have people publishing articles in Nature directly calling for the abandonment of the standard evolutionary model. Because it does not account for, and in no way, shape, form, or fashion can explain different things that they're discovering. When it is still in the...
That is an argument from incredulity.
No, I'm referring to papers that are published.
No, I understand that, but there's still an argument for incredulity. Even if the author of the paper says, I can't imagine how this could be explained.
No, hang on. If you're presenting evidence which debunks and directly is in contradiction to a fundamental piece that is being presented as evidence from the opposition, how is that an argument from incredulity? You're literally showing why they're incorrect.
Okay, so the argument for incredulity is, so you'll probably have to point me to a specific piece of evidence so that we can talk about the details, because you threw a lot of data points at me in your opening. And like I said, I was not able to keep track of them all. I'm not familiar with them all. I don't know the details. If you want to pick one that you think is the strongest one.
Just for, I don't know if it's the strongest one, but just for example purposes, the gene-centric model is getting massive pushback, even though it was the...
Okay, I didn't mean an example of something that's getting pushback. I meant an example of some data that contradicts part of the established theory.
Well, I'm getting to that.
Okay.
So, for really since the selfish gene, the gene-centered theory was considered the central, basically the central dogma of biology and evolutionary theory.
Well, that's
what they are.
True, but okay.
Well, I mean, that's what they say in the papers about it, and the ones that are going in contradiction to it. But
You'll
anyway,
have
my
to
point
point
is,
me to a paper that says the gene theory is the central dogma, because it was never a dogma. It was a hypothesis advanced by Richard Dawkins. It turned out to be correct, and that's the reason that he's famous.
well, no,
The
the point I'm making right now is that he was not correct.
Okay.
It's genes are but a minimal component of what has to be explained in evolution.
Okay.
That is what is the entire point.
Okay.
And you just argued that it was correct when they are discovering that there may be portions of it that are correct, but it is in no way, shape, form, or fashion a total explanation. You have to factor in all the things of epigenetics. You've got the modification variables that take a single gene and result in many different dynamic outcomes based on variables.
Okay.
And so when you're trying to explain evolution through single modifications to a gene, and you find out that if through mutations, when you find out that those aren't necessarily the things that are actually causing the change. And so, for example, a very interesting example is grasshoppers and locusts. So all locusts are actually grasshoppers. Not all grasshoppers are locusts. They actually undergo a complete metamorphosis. However, nothing in their genes actually change. It is all about the regulatory components of the supposed junk DNA that didn't have any bearing and is supposedly evidence for evolution. It turns out that A, it is extraordinarily important, and B, actually has the ability to do a phenotypic change. And so you have to look at this from a perspective of the synchronicity, one, that's required, because very minor modifications can cause cascade effects. So you have a tremendous difference to the overall framework that's already existing and can be executed through not being modified by the genes, which has been a very adamant talking point for those defending evolution, such as yourself. And so the point I'm making is that what we are rapidly discovering almost on a daily basis is all these new variables. So then you have to insert into the equation if what is actually we're starting to discover is actually causing body plan changes and significant the phenotypic changes. Then we cannot rely on this over here anymore. But now we have exponentially more things that have to happen in synchronicity in order for this mutation to occur. But then that's where things start to get extraordinarily chaotic. Is this even a remotely reasonable expectation that all of these things can happen in synchronicity in completely disparate locations that also have time variables from both a 3D and a 4D perspective to be executed? And part of the reason I often argue that when you look at what humans are currently trying to copy in the context of DNA computing and storage and all those kind of things, I doubt anyone would ever, even though we're attempting to use the exact same processes, I doubt anybody with half a brain would conclude that what we're attempting to do, which is basically the exact same thing, could ever come and be executed without the intelligent agents at hand. So if you're going to argue that the thing that we would over here would say couldn't happen, did happen, except the one that did happen that you're arguing had exponentially more layers.
Okay. I was with you up until the locusts. After that, I kind of lost you, but let me just try to address a couple of your points. The first is that you mentioned epigenetics. By the way, have you actually read The Selfish Gene?
I have. I've read all of Dawkins' books.
Okay.
They're extraordinarily boring and long-winded, but I have read them. especially when you read them from a modern knowledge base and you realize how much of the crap he was spewing has been disproven. Yeah, they get very boring. But go ahead.
Okay. So there was a genetic a biological dogma that was widely held to be true in the 70s when Dawkins wrote his book. And that dogma went something like, a gene can be equated to a sequence of DNA in an organism, and it works by transcoding itself into a protein through a ribosome, and those proteins interact with each other through their folding and by having certain receptor sites, yada, yada, yada. And that is all that happens. The dogma was there is nothing else. And it turns out that dogma was wrong. There is something else. There's epigenetics. The process is actually much more complicated than that. Vastly more complicated than that. And again, I readily concede that life is complicated. It's really hard to see at first glance how it could have come about without it is by purely natural processes. But Dawkins did not assume that a gene was a sequence of DNA base pairs. In fact, he explicitly disclaimed that. He spends an entire chapter talking about how that's not what he's talking about by a gene. What he's talking about by a gene is any container of information that can transcribe itself into some kind of physical effect by any mechanism. Now, DNA certainly qualifies it. It can transcribe itself into proteins, which obviously has phenotypic effects in the world. But that was the whole point of the selfish gene, was that there could be other kinds of phenotypic effects. And then he wrote a whole book about what those are. And so epigenetics is it's not at all a threat to the theory of evolution. It is, in fact, exactly the kind of refinement you'd expect from the scientific process. So another example of this is the transition from Newtonian mechanics to relativity. The huge revolutions happen in scientific thought. Relativity is about as radically different from Newtonian mechanics as you can get conceptually, but it's not a radical break from Newtonian mechanics in terms of the science. It's not that Newton got it wrong. It's just that there was an extra layer of subtlety that he just wasn't aware of because he didn't have the data. It turns out that Newtonian mechanics is just an approximation to relativity at slow speeds and in weak gravitational fields. And relativity is a generalization of that. So epigenetics is just a generalization of the narrow view. You can view the biological dogma of the 1970s as the Newtonian mechanics of biology, and epigenetics as the relativity theory of
right.
biology,
But the
an analogy.
I would say there's quite a few folks in the evolutionary biology world that would not necessarily agree with you. I've read their papers, and
yeah, I keep hearing that, and I keep asking people to point me to papers, and nobody's done that yet.
I'll send you a link to my folder where I've got a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, please
do. But the problem with the epigenetic component is that a significant percentage of the things that are supposedly evidence for evolution are actually causing modifications to existing function rather than the creation of new. And when you consider that, you have to account for how do these variables exist?
They exist because they provide reproductive fitness to the organism.
But how did they already occur?
Originally by random mutation.
Okay, so you're saying that through random mutation, that in the gene sequence, which is then modified by the epigenetic factors, somehow accounted for future unknowns that have not yet occurred and have not been a variable in regard to the fitness argument.
That is not what I'm saying.
Well, I'm saying that's what you have to account for. because that is exactly what they have discovered, and that's
Okay,
why
so
it's causing
say that again, because I want to make sure that I understand what it is that you think I have to account for.
Okay, so for example, let's say when you're let's say you're writing functions, right? And you commented out one. Okay, so it's still there, right? But it's not going to be executed in the here and now. Okay, but then then obviously, as you know full well, we're working on all this kind of stuff in machine learning and such. But the now a new variable that is relative or relevant to that function you'd already accounted for is now needed, and you go in and remove the comments. No new functionality was created. Existing functionality was just activated, and that is what they are discovering in epigenetics, as well as the dual use gene sequences and a variety of other things where it is literally being modified based on external variables that are inserted into the equation that are completely separate. So you now have to account for both the functionality as well as the modification to said functionality that works in a hyper-specific way.
But modification is just a kind of functionality.
No, not if it's, I mean, obviously, yes, that is a type of functionality, but it's resulting in an entirely different outcome of the...
But what difference does that make? If that outcome improves the reproductive fitness of the organism that possesses it, that seems to me to be entirely consistent with evolutionary theory.
How do you, okay, how do you explain the, this protein sequence, for example, that done this way equals A, done this way equals B, but there's absolutely no difference to the source sequence, and the variable is not related to that sequence? But that's like having a mod in a different folder.
You'd have to give me a specific example for me to be able to tell a reasonable story about how that came about. But let's just take the locust example.
That's what I was talking about in context of microRNAs, right? What they discovered. Okay, so in the so gene is being transcribed into mRNA, right? While that's happening, based on a additional variable.
So hold on, is there a difference between microRNA and non-microRNA? This is a term I have never heard before.
So microRNAs are a relatively recent discovery. And I say relatively recent, like really started to dive into them in the last decade.
Okay.
So
I mean, I don't know anything about these, so
well, this is what I'm trying to explain to you. This is one of the things that really, when I discovered this, or I just discovered it, when I started reading papers on it and listening to lectures from the people that discovered it.
Our time here is limited, and this might not be the most effective use of our time here for you to start trying to educate me about a particular area of biology. Can we talk about locusts instead?
Sure.
Okay, so you brought up locusts. You said that some grasshoppers have the ability to undergo this transformation and become locusts.
And before you answer that, John, I just wanted to jump in because the discussion's so engaging and fun. The audience is loving it. What we're going to do, I'm going to add probably another 10 or 15 minutes to the discussion. We're just going to keep a short, really fast-paced question and answer at the ending. So we'll keep it mostly discussion. So sorry about that. Keep it going, guys.
Okay. Anyway, so locusts. There are some grasshoppers are able to transform themselves into a radically different form. I presume that it's the one that has wings and lets them fly, right?
Yes, I mean they undergo a pretty significant body structure modification in a very rapid period of time.
Right.
And when the external variables go away, they can actually switch back, but they can also reproduce, and their offspring will be locust form, not grasshopper form. So basically, what you're having to look at here is there are the equivalent, just for example purposes, there's the equivalent of 2 templates installed that can be switched back and forth. And which in and of itself requires a dramatic amount of variables to be accounted for from a regulatory perspective.
Okay, there's one thing you just said that got my attention, which is that the ones that undergo this transformation then transfer that transformation to their offspring.
They can.
They can. Okay. But they don't necessarily do?
Correct. They can, if they switch back. Like, so let's say they were a grasshopper, they turn into a locust, they turn back into a grasshopper, then their offspring's going to be a grasshopper. If they have offspring while they're a locust, then it's a locust.
Okay.
And
I'm probably going to have to go off and do some homework of this, but so far, nothing that I've heard here sounds even remotely like a threat to evolutionary theory, because insects change their body form. That's a common thing. Lots of insects start off as caterpillars or larvae that look radically different from their adult form. So having radical changes.
I don't know if you necessarily want to go down the caterpillar rabbit hole, because that one's a rather dramatic smack in the face of Darwinian theory.
How so?
Well, without any modification to the genome, it literally dissolves, and then it keeps like 2 or 3 types of its cells, and then rebuilds a completely different phenotype. And so you're having to account for 2 different phenotypic structures in the exact same genome, and all of the variables that are accounted with.
But that's easy.
How
that's
so?
Easy.
How so?
It provides an advantage in terms of reproductive fitness. Now, what is that advantage is fair for you to ask. And the answer to that is...
Let me ask you a question. How do you think it is remotely plausible that a entirely different phenotypic structure can somehow have created itself?
Well, it didn't create itself. It came about gradually. It didn't start out that way.
Okay, but you have to consider the argument of the evolutionary argument here from a actual, your fitness argument sounds great in theory. However, when you actually start to consider,
it does because it's correct.
And I think you need to go research some of these things I've postulated tonight, and I think you may have a little bit of a different opinion on the security of your position. By the time you get
send me pointers to papers, I'll read them and we'll reconvene and we can dive into the weeds.
But what I'm saying with all this is this whole it's reproductive fitness argument. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So the caterpillar turning into a butterfly. If it doesn't have the ability to do the entire transformation, then its body is literally going to dissolve. It has to have the entire in the cocoon. It literally dissolves, and then keeps a very core component of a few cell types, and then builds an entirely new body plan.
Yeah, that's right.
So you have to have, and so if that caterpillar doesn't have all of its wings and all the different components that it needs at the initial point, do you actually think that is going to be beneficial to reproductive fitness? If it has half a wing or a quarter of a wing, do you really think that all the legs it had running around on the tree eating, eating leaves? So it's got some of its legs left, and it's got a one wing popping out the side because it doesn't yet have all of the requirements in the regulatory components, because the gene sequences are almost like they're nuts in and of themselves. When you think about the regulatory components that are required, you're getting into a whole nother stratosphere. And you're saying that the little caterpillar running around with one wing flapping around is better for fitness.
Come on, John.
Come on, man. Come on. You don't actually believe that.
Of course I don't believe it.
Okay,
because that's a straw man argument.
No, it's not.
Nobody believes
that's a literal argument.
No.
Nobody believes it? Well, then
nobody believes that the evolutionary pathway to a butterfly with 2 wings was a butterfly with 1 wing. No one believes that.
So you think that both wings popped in simultaneously? And everything else is needed?
I don't know what the evolutionary pathway for butterflies was. I'd have to go look it up. But I'm very confident that somebody's figured it out. And if you gave me 5 minutes on Wikipedia, I could just
that's why I brought up the phylogeny arguments of oh man, we've been able to create algorithms that can account for the steps that had to been taken. Those are literally based on assumptions and inference that, hey, what would have happened to get from A to B? That's why I use the example of, cool, we're looking at source code that has some similar functions, but this one has additional ones. And hey, we're now going to run an algorithm to figure out what mods would have had to have happened to, in an undirected manner, for the functions that are needed to go from type A to type B.
Yeah, sure.
Could have happened.
Reconstructing historical events is always fraught with all manner of difficulty.
Yeah, but you're missing
and
the
sometimes
point.
You have to make inferences.
Okay, I agree with that. I agree with you 100% because I'm making inferences based on logic that is more likely, logical, plausible, and probable that the intelligent agent was required, and that this could not happen through your undirected natural selection.
Because you can't imagine how it could have happened.
No, because I think it's ridiculous to think that it could happen that way.
Okay, characterize it however you will.
So you
do not see, for whatever reason, how it could happen. Therefore, it could not possibly have happened.
No. You're saying, oh, I can think of a way that it is possible that if all of these variables happened in a perfect manner.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Well, that's what's required.
I'm saying exactly the opposite. I can't think of it, but I do believe that if I go to Wikipedia, I'll find somebody else who's figured it out.
Well, you'll find that many of them, they have not. There hasn't been a paper on this.
On the evolutionary history of butterflies? I would be shocked.
Since 2010, there has not been a single paper on this. And before that, they hadn't answered the question. There's not been a single paper since 2010.
Okay, well, then maybe I'll have learned something new today.
But that's beside the point. The point I'm making is that, yes, anybody with half a brain can probably think up of a hypothetical of how, yes, if all of these things happened,
no, that's not true. That's not true. It's hard to figure these things out. I've said this again and again today. It's not easy. That's why the people who figure these things out are famous and worthy of respect.
I don't disagree that people are worthy of respect, but I'm saying that many of their if you go read, I've got a couple papers on this, but you can Google it too. There was one I read earlier today from 2018. There was another one from 2020 where they freely admitted and were discussing the reality that the phylogenetic models that they're using and algorithms to try and explain all this stuff go absolutely haywire, number one. And then number two, when you insert the microRNA variable, a completely different result comes out when you use the exact same logic.
Okay.
And completely destroys the evolutionary trees that supposedly have been established and proven by these amazing people who should deserve our bowing and scraping and worship.
I didn't say bowing and scraping and worship. I said respect.
I'm being facetious. What I'm saying is that there's people, they're like directly stating, cool. So our data actually doesn't show what we've been saying it shows. And then when we insert these new variables, in some aspects, it shows the exact opposite.
Okay.
So now you're back to being faced with, so is it more reasonable to conclude that something that appears to be designed, per your earlier argument, and has dramatic evidence of extraordinary control logic that is required for execution of these things, that have massive intricacies that are interdependent components that a decade ago we thought were not even relevant or you didn't even know they existed. And now we're discovering that the things that we were taking for granted and thought we had accounted for in evolutionary theory now don't even come close to explaining some of these new components, and actually now show that a huge portion of our supposedly proven arguments are collapsing and are showing like dramatically counter data. So my point is that, and this goes back to my investor analogy, right? So now your evolution is who knows how many different theories, like extended modern synthesis and all the different ones that are out now. It's like the investors who are now on round 15 and they're burning, the daily burn rate's $15 million and they're not even close to profitability. And I mean, think about WeWork with SoftBank, right? What all the craziness just happened with them. They eventually finally had to kick him out and cut their losses for the most part. Okay. Same, in my opinion, with what we're discovering, the same logic applies, but people don't want to open their eyes because it would mean they have to.
on your profitability argument, where's the profit in intelligent design? Where is the product that has been produced as a result of somebody following the intelligent design hypothesis?
Well, I mean,
I can give you
I'm
lots of examples
using
of
an
products
ego
that
comparison, but
have
in
been developed as a result of mainstream biology and evolutionary theory.
well, see,
In fact, the entire pharmacological industry is based on it. So where's the product? Where's the beef?
Well, see, I'm not really sure how that obvious pivots and try to.
No, this was your analogy. You're the one saying that we should judge it on the basis of how well they're able to produce a profit. So where's the profit?
I wasn't referring to the profitability in this context. I was talking about the mindset of the investors in not wanting to admit that they were wrong on backing an idea.
Okay, that's
I don't care about the ROI is a
yeah, you're right. The sunk cost fallacy is a thing, and it's entirely possible that people are sticking with evolution because of the sunk cost fallacy. I don't think so, but it's possible. I think we're getting stuck in a rut here. So what I would like to suggest is that, because we only have 15 minutes left, that we table this. You send me some papers, I'll read them, and we'll reconvene when I'm better informed and better able to hold up my end of the argument on the details.
I'll send you some papers, and I'll pose a question to you.
Yeah.
Do you think it would be stupidly cool if you had a programming language that was two different ones in the same line of code? You could have two different functions simultaneously in the same.
I actually have such a programming language.
Oh yeah, what's that?
Lisp.
Oh, well, okay. Well, yeah.
So I can embed other syntaxes in the middle, and I do actually.
I forgot about Lisp.
So yes, it is stupidly cool.
Okay, so having that dual syntax. Mm-hmm. Well, you're being able to embed other syntax. There can be two different pieces of information in the read from the exact same syntax. Yeah,
you can do that too. Right? Actually, you can do that in any programming language. There are actually people do this for recreation. They write C programs. They write programs that are valid code in multiple languages. So you can take the same code and compile it under right. C and under Perl. And it's kind of a cool trick.
Right.
But yeah, this is well known.
Do you think that could, where I'm going with all this, do you think that doing that would ever be possible without an intelligent agent?
Yes, absolutely.
How so?
Telling that story is easy. I would have to get into computability theory and the universality of computing. But the reason that it's not a big deal, the reason nobody's famous for doing this, is because the process by which it is done is well understood. That's why it's a recreational activity.
Not fun. No, I understand the process is understood. I'm talking about the actual execution of it.
Yeah.
So you think a program that is doing that could create itself?
Yeah.
How?
How do
the dual syntaxes take form without the intelligent agent? And then how is a program written in it that can now be executed without, whether it be a AI that's executing it or a human, either one, without one of those two variables, how does it happen?
That is not a question that I can answer in the available time.
So you actually think that it could happen without the intelligent agent?
Yeah, there's no question about it. It's something that everybody who is well-versed in computability theory knows the answer to immediately. It's not even hard.
Okay, so then why isn't it happening?
Why isn't what happening?
What? Okay, so you're saying that because of computability theory, that you're saying that programming languages and programs can create themselves without intelligent agents.
Uh-huh.
Example.
Well, hasn't happened because that's not what programming languages are for. Programming languages are for interfacing with human brains. So it's just that the programming languages don't arise spontaneously because...
Not in theory, in real world application, how could it ever occur?
Again,
there's all sorts of things that can happen.
Yeah.
or theoretically could happen, but
Yes.
from a real world perspective, would not.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So the direct question I'm asking you is, do you actually think in a real world scenario without any interaction from an intelligent agent, you think that all the stuff that we're talking about right now could somehow occur and the mechanisms which are required for it to be executed could also come into existence?
Yes, it could. Why hasn't it happened? Because it's extremely unlikely.
Okay. But if an intelligent agent was doing it, it's not that hard, right?
That's right. I mean, so the thing that intelligence does is it makes all of these design processes and search processes more efficient. Everything happens much faster when you apply intelligence. That's what intelligence does, is it helps prune these search spaces.
So
there's nothing that intelligence fundamentally enables that cannot happen without intelligence.
Really? So you think that do you think a piece of iron could turn itself into a sword with no intelligent agent?
Yes, extremely unlikely.
Okay. No, I'm talking about from a plausibility perspective.
Well, of course, it's not plausible.
Okay, so if something is not plausible, again, to my point of, hey, hypothetically, this could happen, is you'd have to have a genius brain to come up with the hypothetical of how a piece of iron could turn itself into a sword.
Sure.
Right.
And I could tell you a story based on quantum mechanics about how the iron atoms could rearrange themselves, and we could do the math on how probable that is, and it would be an extremely small number. So let's take a look at a specific scenario that you claim is extremely unlikely and do the math on it. And you get to pick the scenario. But we can't do it here and now. We don't have the time.
Of course. SFT, do we want to go to, we're getting close to time. Should we go to Q&A?
Actually, I was just going to give you a minute warning. So you guys are
I think
on time. We'll do like a speed round. We've got 10 minutes. So we'll do speed round with these questions. You guys can give a little bit of feedback per question, but just try not to keep it too long so we can get through as many as possible in 10 minutes. And great discussion, really good. So everybody in the chat, share this debate because I really enjoyed it, and it looks like everyone else did. So thanks, guys. Speed round time. Let's get to it. So George Bond, thanks so much for your super chat. Like I said, you're putting my kids through college. So thanks, brother. He says, Matt is asleep now. He let us go over 16 hours last night. That's true. Matt had a record-breaking stream last night. So let's go to questions for the debaters now. Gutsit Gibbon, thanks for your question. This one's for John. She says, can you give me an example of a paper that is causing an uproar over evolution as a concept, rather than just general genetics papers? Haven't seen one yet. Go ahead there, John.
Yeah, I've got one in my folder. There's the most recent one, one I read a couple days ago was from Nature, and it was, I think it was titled, let's do away with modern synthesis, yes or no. I think it was the title, something like that.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for that response there, John. Next question, George Bond. The question is for you, Ron. He asks, can evolution explain the metamorphic process from a caterpillar to a butterfly? Go ahead.
I believe it can. I don't know how. I'm not a biologist. I'd have to look it up. I'd go to Wikipedia and look it up, and I would be surprised if there wasn't an article about it.
Oh, sorry about that. I was on mute. Okay, yeah, thanks for the answer. Okay, let's, next question is from, let me see, Redefine Living. Question is for you again, Ron. He says, epigenetics has debunked many things they thought was evolution. How is that proof for evolution? Go ahead.
I don't even know how to parse that. So first of all, I don't accept the premise that epigenetics has debunked evolution. And if I do accept that premise, then I don't know how to make sense of the second half. How is it proof for evolution? I'm sorry, I just don't understand the question.
No problem. John, did you have a quick response there?
I think they're probably referring to earlier when we were discussing this, that I think you said something to the effect of that it was just a component of evolution. And when we were talking about gene modifications, and I was saying that it wasn't a gene sequence mod, it was a variable that had to be already accounted for inside the sequence.
It was your question, Ron. You can have the last word.
Let's say that this whole epigenetics thing, the ways in which genes interact with their environments can be incredibly complicated. That's a fact. If it is really true that there are epigenetic things that happen that get passed on hereditarily, that would be news to me. That would be Lamarckism, which, as far as I know, has been discredited. And if there was actually evidence that that happened, it would surprise me. I doubt it would shake my beliefs to the core, but I'd have to see the evidence first.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that answer there, Ron. Next question. It's for you, Ron. For you again, Ron. They're coming at you. Science is
Bring it on.
We got a lot of creationists in here, but
yeah, I figured.
They're loving the debate, though. That's good. So this question from Science is Observable. Thanks for the question there. He asks, do you believe directed panspermia is a possible explanation for the origin of life? Take your time, Ron.
Yes. The answer to that question is just a flat out yes, it's possible. I personally don't believe it just because there isn't any evidence for it, but it would not rock my worldview if evidence for it were discovered someday. Okay,
and response at all there, John?
Nah, I'm good. Let's go to the next one. We want to run out of time. I got 6 minutes.
Okay, next question is from Call Me Emo. Thanks for your question there, Emo. Questions for you, Maddox. How do we apply your arguments to show that species are wholly unrelated to each other when all these characteristics are conserved throughout most extant life forms? That's a bit of a mouthful, so take your time.
I've never argued that there is a species relationship inside of families. That is obvious. However, there's been several papers, the most recent one I think it was in 2018, that showed significant barriers at those levels in the mods, and so having the expansion of all that goes back to the point I was making of accounting for pre-existing templates. I mean, which we're now observing in gene modification through epigenetics and a variety of other factors, that there's subset pieces that are not active and then can be activated. They're not being created, they're being activated. And the part of the reason I brought up the whole aspect of the locus is that that's a readily observable example of that there can be an entirely subset template in play that can be activated. So you can extrapolate out that same logic, and if the earlier form had the capacity for all these subsets, then when the variables came in play that activated that information, it's not unreasonable that there's going to be what we're viewing as species. I mean, that's a completely logical conclusion if you're looking at it from a top-down perspective.
Would you like a response to that there, Ron?
I don't really have a response, but I will make an editorial comment, which is that I believe that the whole concept of species is a little bit of a red herring. It's a concept that entered into evolutionary theory early on because it seems like a reasonable way to categorize things, but it turns out to be not nearly as well-formed a concept as it first appears. And talking about species, I think, muddies the waters more than it clarifies them.
Awesome. It was your question, John. You can have the last word if you like.
Go ahead. We got 3 minutes.
Next question.
We have 3 minutes.
Okay, we're going really speed round here now. So Honesty Angel, thanks so much for your question. Question is for Ron. Out of the research you've done on ID and young Earth creation, what do you think is the best evidence presented?
So those are completely different. ID, frankly, I don't think has any good evidence at all. I've seen none. Sorry. Young Earth creationism, it's not about evidence. It's about faith. It's a theological position. And it starts from the belief that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God. And from there, I agree with young Earth creationists that the intellectually honest conclusion is young Earth creationism if you start from that premise. But I don't.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, time for one more question.
We might be able to run a little over. I can go until my wife summons me for dinner if you want to run over.
That's usually the case for me. So, okay, then that being the case.
Watching in the other room, Ron?
I'm not sure. Her office is upstairs, so I'm
getting pretty hungry, Ron. Are we invited?
Excuse me? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Plenty for everyone.
I'll jump on a plane right away. Okay, let's. So I got a question from Tony, my man with the plan. He asks, question for Ron: is he aware that producing RNA in the lab requires pre-existing information and highly controlled, manipulated conditions that do not mimic the early Earth?
Yeah. Abiogenesis is still a mystery.
Quick response there, John, or go to the next?
I mean, my response would be yes, it's still a mystery. And secondarily, when you look at all of the variables and the point we were talking earlier about, is it possible for a piece of iron to turn into a sword? It's the exact same type of math, except even less probable. And at some point, you have to come to the conclusion that it is not plausible, and then insert the intelligent agent into the equation where it becomes very plausible.
Okay, so for this, I do have a response.
Of course, yeah, it's your question. Last word goes to you, Ron.
That the math is really very different. The quantum mechanical math for iron turning into swords is really radically different from the combinatorial math for organic molecules to turn themselves into carriers of information.
And it's way harder for that.
No, it's not. But we can make that a topic for a future.
I think when the improbability reaches higher than the total number of actions in the history of the universe, I'd say the probability is 0.
Well, that's true, but the question is that actually the case here? And that is far from clear.
Except that the goalpost keeps getting further and further away. The more research, the more experiments they do, the further and further the goalpost goes.
Citation needed.
Okay, there we go. There's the last word. So let's go to Alec Cox. Thanks so much for your question. Ask Ron, he says, how the first cell was able to use glucose without the proper digestive system.
Again, this is getting into the weeds of biology, which I'm not a biologist, so I can't really answer that. But I will say that by the time you get to a cell, a lot of stuff has already happened. Cells are already incredibly complicated things, and there are lots and lots and lots of chemical precursors that have to be put into place before you get to the first cell. So this gets back to abiogenesis is still a mystery, and that's one of the reasons it's still a mystery, is because there is a lot of complexity there even before you get to cells. They're making progress, but they haven't figured it out yet.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. And I'm going to make this one the last question, just so I can give you each a minute or two to kind of just sum everything up, and kind of like in the form of a concluding statement, since we kind of ended the discussion abruptly. So this last one is from Paul Anderson. For you, Ron. Thanks for the question there, Paul. He says, Ron, how do you explain the precision of life support on Earth? Example, if there was a change to Earth's sun orbit, did this precision happen by accident? If so, have you ever studied statistics?
I have studied statistics. I recognize the delicate balance of life here on Earth. There are two answers to that. The first is that the Earth was not delicately tuned to support us. We were delicately tuned to be adapted to the conditions here on Earth. And the second answer is that there's such a vast number of planets in the universe that there isn't even a number for it. And almost certainly Only a tiny fraction of them probably have the conditions needed to support life. But even a tiny fraction of a huge number is still a huge number. And so almost certainly it's happened in other places. We just haven't figured out where yet.
I always love the law of large numbers and deep time track that people like to go down and still avoid the is this actually plausible?
Why? What part of that do you?
Well, in science, in pretty much any other field, if implausibility or improbability reaches certain levels, the hypothesis being presented is usually discounted, and it's like, hey, we need to start looking for another explanation. And given the fact that abiogenesis, in conjunction with the fine-tuning arguments and all of those components for the universe and all that stuff, when you think about that, there has literally never been anything that has ever been postulated or studied in all of science that has a lower, or the improbability becomes so mind-bending that it's why would you suspend the normal scientific process in terms of, is this even a valid thing to pursue, and go down it, which is why I often talk about a lot of this is purely desperation to avoid the obvious.
So the fine-tuning of the universe is a different question than the fine-tuning of the conditions here on Earth, which is what I understood the question to be about.
Well, the fine-tuning elements of the universe also apply to the chemistry and physics requirement for the chemical processes that occur for...
Yeah, I mean, the fine-tuning of the universe and the creation of atoms is a prerequisite for everything that happens here. But then on top of that, there's additional fine-tuning that you need
to get life
here on Earth, right?
On that. I'm saying that they all...
So I thought we were just talking about that second fine-tuning. The first fine-tuning has a different answer, and it's a much weaker answer, because there we don't have the law of large numbers, because we really, as far as we know, we only have one universe. And there might be other universes out there. Quantum mechanics kind of sort of indicates that there are, but that really is going a bit of a reach, maybe more than a bit of a reach. But the fact that there are myriad other planets out there, that is not a reach at all. That's well established mainstream science.
The hypothesis. Although there's regular studies that come out that usually lower that number pretty significantly on a regular basis, of like, oh wait, we just figured out a new variable that shrinks this. Oh, we just discovered that there's fewer of these. I'm not suggesting that the point you're making.
There's a bunch of things that we did just discover in that regard, but those things are actual planets. And this is recent. This is like the last 20 years or so. Before that, it really was speculation whether there were other planets out there. But now we know for sure that there are, because we've actually seen them.
Oh no, I'm aware of that. One of the interesting things I have discovered about those planets they found, though, is that there seems to be some rather interesting synchronicity in our solar system that does not appear to exist in any of the other ones that they have seen so far.
Oh yeah, they're different than we expected them to be. That's true.
Orbits are all bizarre, and there's all sorts of things that they're actually rather surprised by the dramatic rarity and the seeming speciality of ours.
Absolutely right.
Okay, why don't we end it there then? Really good question and answer, Ron. Thanks for giving us a few more minutes here too. I appreciate it. Why don't we end it with, I guess since Ron, you started, just give a minute or two, kind of sum everything up, give us your thoughts on how you think the debate went. We'll do the same with John, and then we'll call it a night. Okay.
So thanks again for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, John, for really stimulating conversation, and for keeping it respectful, and I enjoyed it. I'd like to do it again. So thank you.
Thank you, Ron. We're always happy to have you. John, over to you.
No, I had a great time. I've really enjoyed it. Ron, thanks so much for your time. As I said in my opening statement, I know that people like you, you're very often difficult to track down. So I appreciate you spending time with us and having this conversation. And obviously we we disagree on a few points, but I actually do greatly appreciate you also being, us being actually able to have dialogue. It's amazing how so often when people opposite opinions on some things, we agree on some things and we have polar opposite opinions on others. It's amazing how in modern society, the whole premise of dialogue and debate has become a rarity, and it turns into sniping on both sides and nobody actually listening to the other person's positions and arguments. So thank you very much for that. I'd love to have more conversations with you in the future, and hopefully I'll convince you that while probability may exist, the plausibility is not a rational conclusion.
I'm happy to listen to your arguments. Don't hold your breath.
Awesome. I agree. It was a very engaging debate today. That's what we strive to have here on this channel, respectful dialogue where we can kind of hear each other out. So I appreciate you guys giving us your time. Quick announcement for the audience, for everybody. Friday, 9:30 EST, we're having Bill Morgan versus David, who's goes by Kakarot on YouTube. So that'll be Creation versus Evolution. Stay tuned for that one. Yeah, other than that, thanks for the awesome questions from the audience. Thanks to the debaters. And we're going to call it a night. Matt, whenever you're ready, brother.